Hey guys, tonight we're dimming the lamps, fluffing the pillows, and gliding back to a time when the home was supposed to be a safe, civilized sanctuary. The Edwardian era, roughly 1901 to 1914. A short, fashionable stretch squeezed between Queen Victoria's endless reign and the chaos of World War I. On the surface, it looked like a golden age. Lace curtains, polished furniture, and tea served at precisely 4 o'clock. If you were middle class, you finally had a parlor that pretended you were wealthier than you really were. If you were upper class, you had entire mansions stuffed with servants, dinner bells, and too many dining forks. But under all the manners and porcelain teacups, there was danger. Because the Edwardian house was basically a ticking time bomb. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in a slow, creeping, oops, the wallpaper just killed the baby sort of way. Yes, the Edwardian house was full of inventions that were meant to improve daily life, but instead turned kitchens and drawing rooms into laboratories of accidental death. Tonight, we're going to drift through some of the most dangerous household items of the era and the quietly tragic ways families tried, and sometimes failed, to survive them. So, take a deep breath, maybe light a candle that definitely isn't made of arsenic, and let's wander through some rooms of domestic doom. Let's start with wallpaper. Wallpaper in the Edwardian era wasn't just decoration. It was practically a declaration of social status. The busier the pattern, the fancier the family. Tiny floral sprays for the modest, heavy damasks for the wealthy. But if you really wanted to impress your guests, you chose green. Not just any green, Shields green or Paris green. Bright, jewel-toned, eye-watering green. It looked luxurious. It also happened to be made of arsenic. Because, of course it was. The arsenic in the pigment slowly flaked off the walls, mixed with dust, and drifted into the lungs of whoever had the misfortune of living there. People would cough, wheeze, and, if they were unlucky, fade away with mysterious gastric troubles. Doctors argued for decades whether wallpaper could really kill. Meanwhile, entire nurseries were painted with enough arsenic to drop a horse. One particularly tragic story comes from the 1860s, when the family of a prominent doctor lost several children in their beautiful arsenic-green home. The symptoms were puzzling, but when the wallpaper was finally removed, the deaths stopped. It didn't take Sherlock Holmes to put 2 and 2 together. But here's the Edwardian twist. Even after all this, people still wanted green. The companies didn't care. By 1900, the industry started phasing out arsenic dyes, but they never admitted fault. Families just quietly peeled the paper and replaced it, hoping the neighbors wouldn't notice, because nothing said social embarrassment like admitting your drawing room was a death trap. Now, let's float over to the gas lamps. Electricity existed in Edwardian Britain, but not for everyone. It was expensive, unreliable, and honestly, a bit terrifying to the average person. Gaslighting, though, that was everywhere. Imagine pipes running under your floors and inside your walls, carrying invisible, flammable gas. Then imagine that your main way of controlling these lamps was striking a match. What could possibly go wrong? The leaks were constant. Sometimes you'd walk into a room and smell that faint, sweet gas odor. Families tried to ignore it, thinking it was just a little leak. But a single spark could turn the whole parlor into an explosive device. And even if it didn't explode, there was the problem of suffocation. Stories circulated of families who fell asleep in their gas-lit bedrooms and never woke up. The official explanation was usually heart failure or bad air. The actual cause was carbon monoxide, but Edwardians weren't too keen on admitting they'd basically installed suffocation devices on their ceilings. By the 1910s, electricity was creeping in, but only for the rich. The middle class kept their gas lamps a little longer. A dangerous compromise, safer than candles, deadlier than darkness. And speaking of candles, let's not forget fire. The Edwardians were obsessed with fabrics. Curtains, drapes, shawls, tablecloths. If it could be covered, it was covered. And most of it was cotton, lace, or wool, which meant the home was basically a soft, flammable tinderbox. Women in particular were at risk. Imagine wearing a floor-length muslin gown, brushing past an open fire, or leaning over a gas stove. One stray spark, and suddenly you were the evening entertainment, just not in the fun way. There are so many accounts of women dying this way that newspapers stopped bothering to sensationalize them. They were written up in short, brisk notes like, "Lady so-and-so succumbed to her injuries after her skirts caught fire at dinner." Imagine dying horribly, and the headline sounds like a misplaced fashion critique. It wasn't until the invention of less flammable fabrics and a few lawsuits that manufacturers started pretending to care. Until then, the family advice was simple: be careful near the fire, which, as safety slogans go, was not exactly groundbreaking. Now, let's wander into the kitchen, shall we? The Edwardian kitchen was the heart of the home. It was also, without exaggeration, a chamber of domestic hazards. First, the range. These cast-iron beasts dominated the room, belching coal smoke, spewing soot, and radiating uneven waves of heat. They were temperamental and prone to exploding if overstoked. Children were routinely burned just by brushing against them. And then, of course, there was food safety, or the lack thereof. Refrigerators? Rare. Ice boxes? Expensive. Most families just hoped their meat wouldn't rot before Sunday. And when it did, they drowned it in heavy sauces to hide the taste. Gastrointestinal disasters were a regular feature of family life.
Milk was another problem. It looked wholesome, but milk was basically a bacterial soup waiting to happen. Before pasteurization, it carried tuberculosis, typhoid, and diphtheria. Families would pour it over their porridge, blissfully unaware they were spooning disease into their children. Some mothers even diluted it to save money, stretching out the bacteria but not killing it. And then came the tin food revolution. At first, people thought canned goods were miraculous. Open a tin and you had instant dinner. But the tins were often sealed with lead solder, which slowly leached into the food. Long-term, this meant memory loss, mood swings, and the occasional family member who just wasn't quite right. But hey, dinner was faster. We can't talk Edwardian domestic dangers without mentioning toys. Childhood was getting more attention by 1900. Middle-class parents were reading books about child psychology. They wanted to give their little ones stimulating playthings. The toy industry responded with creativity and poison. Painted tin soldiers, lead-based paint. Porcelain dolls, glazed with toxic compounds. Cheap whistles, filled with bacteria because no one thought to clean them before shipping. And the best part? Chemistry sets. These weren't your modern watered-down science kits. They included actual acids, explosives, and detailed instructions on how to set things on fire. Nothing says family bonding like little Edward Jr. burning a hole through the dining table. The irony was that toys were marketed as educational. And they were, if you considered teaching children how to handle death at an early age a form of education. Bathrooms were no safer. The Edwardians adored modern plumbing. A proper house had a bathroom, often tiled in white for that clean, sanitary look. But the plumbing itself was far from safe. Lead pipes delivered water directly to the sink, the same lead that slowly poisoned entire households. And the baths? They were often heated with gas geysers,
small water heaters that had an inconvenient habit of leaking carbon monoxide. More than one person simply relaxed into the tub and never climbed out. A peaceful end, perhaps, but not the kind you'd put in a lifestyle magazine. Even toilets weren't entirely safe. Early flush systems were prone to backing up, sending sewage water in the wrong direction. The polite term was unpleasant odors. The reality was cholera, not exactly the Edwardian spa experience. And now here's where it gets ironic. Despite all these dangers, arsenic wallpaper, gas lamps, and flammable gowns, poisoned milk, Edwardians genuinely believed they were living in the age of progress. Every invention was a sign that life was getting better, safer, cleaner. And to be fair, in some ways it was. Infant mortality rates were dropping, public health campaigns were spreading, people were bathing more often. But in the average home, daily survival still depended on sheer luck, and maybe not licking the walls. Families developed coping strategies. They learned to keep the windows cracked for gas leaks. They placed guards in front of the fire to protect skirts. They boiled milk before serving it. They stopped buying the really bright green wallpaper. But accidents kept happening, and the newspapers kept printing those short, fatal notes. Another gas explosion here, another nursery fire there. The home was supposed to be a retreat from the chaos of the outside world. In reality, it was just another battleground, only the enemy was furniture, food, and fashion. And that's where we'll leave this first gentle stroll. We've peeked at poisonous walls, explosive lamps, and lethal kitchens, but we've only just opened the Edwardian front door. In the next stretch, we'll drift deeper into the quirks of medicine cabinets, the hazards of beauty treatments, and the quietly alarming ways people tried to stay modern while accidentally sabotaging their health. For now, just imagine lying back in your arsenic-green bedroom, gas lamp hissing above you, and a tin of lead-poisoned peaches waiting in the kitchen. Sweet dreams. The Edwardian Medicine Cabinet of Doom. So, we've tiptoed through arsenic wallpaper and exploding lamps. Now let's wander into another corner of Edwardian domestic life, the medicine cabinet. And honestly, calling it a medicine cabinet is generous. It was more like a Pandora's box of patent cures, dangerous powders, and bottles that all looked suspiciously alike. Labels were vague, ingredients weren't regulated, and side effects were, well, usually death. Let's start with the classic laudanum. Laudanum was the wonder drug of the 19th century, and it slid easily into the Edwardian era. It was basically opium dissolved in alcohol, a double whammy. You could buy it at your local chemist without a prescription, like picking up aspirin today. Everyone used it, mothers, fathers, children, even babies. Teething pain? A few drops. Sleepless toddler? A spoonful. Grief-stricken widow? Half the bottle. It worked, of course, it knocked you out, but it also built tolerance and addiction faster than you could say nightcap. Entire families drifted through daily life in a mild narcotic haze, with mothers fainting dramatically, not because they were delicate nerves, but because they were basically high. And when laudanum wasn't handy, you could always grab chloral hydrate. That one was marketed as a soothing syrup for insomnia. Doctors nicknamed it Mickey Finn powder. It worked well enough to knock you out cold, but prolonged use caused hallucinations, tremors, and a charming condition known as chloral habit. Basically dependency with a side of paranoia. Children weren't spared from pharmaceutical roulette. Parents loved dosing their kids with soothing syrups. One famous brand was Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. Sounds wholesome, right? Like something with chamomile and honey. Except it contained morphine. Actual morphine. The syrup was advertised as the mother's friend, which was technically true because if you were a mother in 1905 with 3 screaming children, a spoonful of morphine-laced syrup bought you about 6 hours of silence. Unfortunately, it also bought your baby a fast track to respiratory failure. Pediatric deaths climbed high enough that by the 1910s, reformers finally pushed for regulation. But for decades, families kept a bottle in the cupboard. Kids slept like angels. They just, well, sometimes didn't wake up.
Then there were the tonics. Edwardians adored tonics. They promised energy, vitality, and the glowing complexion of someone who definitely wasn't malnourished. One popular option, strychnine tonics. Yes, strychnine, the rat poison. In very small doses, it acted as a stimulant, so doctors actually prescribed it to people who felt weak or sluggish, which, in Edwardian Britain, was basically everyone. Arsenic also had its fan club. Some tonics advertised a touch of arsenic for vitality. The logic went, if arsenic could give wallpaper that beautiful glow, surely it could brighten your complexion too. Families lined up to swallow tiny doses, believing it would put roses in their cheeks. And it did, for a while, until it also caused nerve damage and organ failure. Another household favorite was cocaine. Yes, plain old cocaine. It showed up in toothache drops, lozenges, and even tonics marketed for kids. A child with a toothache might get a few drops of cocaine solution directly on the gums, and parents wondered why little Edward Jr. was suddenly running circles around the drawing room. Cocaine was also in fashionable beauty products, face creams, even early energizing drinks. The marketing was relentless, for fatigue, for melancholy, for pep. And families bought it, because why not add a sprinkle of narcotic sparkle to your morning routine? Now, let's step gently into the Edwardian bathroom again. This time, not for plumbing disasters, but for beauty treatments. Because beauty in the Edwardian era wasn't just about lace and hats. It was about chemical warfare against your own body. Hair dye, for example, the formulas often included lead acetate. Prolonged use darkened the hair and slowly poisoned the scalp. Women complained of headaches, hair loss, and blackened fingernails. But as long as the hair looked glossy for the dinner party, it was considered a success. Skin treatments were even worse. Freckles were considered unfashionable. The solution? Skin creams with mercury chloride. Apply daily and your freckles faded, because so did your skin health. Prolonged exposure led to trembling hands, drooling, and the slow slide into mercury poisoning. One popular product was called Dr. Campbell's Safe Arsenic Complexion Wafers. The name said safe, the ingredients said arsenic. Women popped these like candy, believing pale, flawless skin was worth a little nausea. Families even passed them around like, "Here, dear, try one of these little wafers. They work wonders." And then there was the corset. Corsets weren't a chemical danger, but they were a daily health hazard. Edwardian corsets were extreme, longer, tighter, designed to create the fashionable S-curve silhouette. This meant forcing your body into a permanent arch with the chest pushed forward and hips thrust back. Women fainted constantly, not because they were fragile flowers, but because their organs were literally being rearranged. Doctors complained of lead liver, where the organ was compressed into a wedge shape. Lungs had less room to expand, which made tuberculosis, already rampant, an even greater risk. But no one cared. A natural silhouette was considered indecent. So mothers laced their daughters tightly, passed out at parties, and pretended this was all completely normal. The men weren't safe either. Men's grooming products came with their own hazards. Hair tonics were full of alcohol and lead. Some promised to cure baldness with mild caustic solutions, which in practice meant chemical burns on the scalp.
Shaving powders often contained arsenic or quicklime. Imagine applying that to your skin at 6 in the morning. Gentle exfoliation was not the outcome. And then there were the cigarettes. Edwardians adored smoking. Cigarettes, cigars, pipes, tobacco was everywhere. Doctors hadn't drawn the connection to lung cancer. In fact, cigarettes were marketed as healthy. Some brands claimed they soothed asthma. Others bragged they cleared the throat. Families smoked at the breakfast table, in nurseries, even during pregnancy. Children grew up in smoke clouds so thick you'd think the house was on fire. And when coughs developed, the solution was usually another tonic or a seaside holiday, because fresh air was the cure for everything.
Let's not forget the fad gadgets. Edwardians loved gadgets. If it plugged in, whirred, or buzzed, they bought it. The domestic wellness craze introduced vibrating belts, electrical massagers, and even home X-ray machines. Yes, X-rays. The machines were marketed as cures for everything from acne to arthritis. Families cheerfully zapped themselves, unaware that repeated exposure to radiation was not ideal. Hair fell out, burns appeared, and long-term cancers followed. But for a brief moment, the Edwardian bathroom felt like a futuristic clinic. Other gadgets included electric corsets, basically corsets with small batteries wired inside designed to stimulate vitality. They tingled, yes, but mostly they just shocked you at random moments, like a cruel party trick. Then there were radium products. Oh yes. Radium was the miracle element of the age. It glowed in the dark. It was powerful. It was exciting. Companies rushed to put radium into everything: face creams, toothpaste, even suppositories. One slogan proudly declared, "A radiant glow from within," which was technically true because radiation sickness literally glowed under certain conditions. Families bought these items believing they were embracing the cutting edge of science. Instead, they were slowly irradiating themselves before bedtime. By now, you can see the theme. The Edwardian home wasn't just dangerous because of accidents, fires, gas leaks, or food poisoning. It was dangerous because families eagerly swallowed, inhaled, or strapped on the latest modern marvels. The trust in progress was absolute. If an advertisement promised energy, beauty, or vitality, people believed it. The chemist was seen as a wizard. The catalog was gospel. And the family medicine shelf became a shrine to innovation with a side of organ failure. So how did families survive? Mostly by luck. Some managed to moderate their use, a few drops of laudanum, not half the bottle, a dab of arsenic cream, not daily smearing, boiling water before drinking it, airing out the house to prevent gas buildup. Small adjustments kept some households alive long enough to see regulations catch up. By the late 1910s and early 1920s, governments finally introduced food and drug safety laws. Advertising claims were curbed. Poison labeling became mandatory. Slowly, the worst offenders disappeared from family cupboards. But in the Edwardian moment, people genuinely thought they were modern, clean, and scientific, while poisoning themselves with every swallow, sip, and dab. It's almost poetic. Progress wrapped in poison. And with that, we've drifted through the medicine cabinet and the vanity table. We've peeked at the morphine syrups, the arsenic wafers, the corsets, the cigarettes, and the glowing radium creams. Next time, we'll slip deeper into the Edwardian home again. This time, into the servants' quarters, where survival meant dodging burns, scrubbing with toxic cleaning products, and occasionally being flattened by malfunctioning machinery. But for now, picture yourself in a quiet Edwardian bedroom. A bottle of soothing syrup on the nightstand, a corset draped on the chair, maybe a glowing jar of radium cream giving the room a faint, eerie light. And you drift off to sleep, blissfully unaware of how much your beauty routine just shortened your lifespan. Sweet dreams. Servants, sculleries, and the household hazards of work.
So far, we've been drifting through the Edwardian home from the point of view of the family. Poisoned wallpapers, corset-induced fainting, morphine-laced baby syrups, your usual upper and middle-class leisure hazards. But most Edwardian homes, at least the respectable ones, ran on the backs of servants. And if you think the family medicine cabinet was a problem, just wait until you see the servants' quarters. Because if danger in the drawing room was subtle, in the kitchen and scullery, it was loud, hot, and very likely to leave you with missing fingers. Let's begin with the scullery maid. The scullery maid was usually the youngest servant in the house, sometimes as young as 12 or 13. Her job? Washing dishes. Endless dishes. Plates, pots, cutlery, and pans. All day, every day. Sounds boring, but it wasn't just boring. It was hazardous. Scullery maids worked with boiling water, harsh soaps, and piles of heavy cast-iron pots. Slip once, and you could pour scalding water over yourself, cut your hands on broken glass, or develop raw, bleeding skin from constant exposure to caustic cleaning powders. And here's the kicker. Most Edwardian cleaning powders contain bleaching agents like caustic soda or carbolic acid. These were strong enough to strip grime and skin. Families liked their dishes white and shiny. Servants paid the price with cracked, scarred hands. In an era before gloves were standard, the solution was usually just, toughen up. A servant with bleeding hands was told to keep working. After all, the family supper service couldn't wait just because your skin was falling off.
Now, let's float to the laundry room. Laundry was a monster task. Clothes weren't just tossed in a machine and forgotten. They were boiled in copper vats over open fires, stirred with heavy wooden paddles, hauled dripping across the floor, then mangled through giant rollers to squeeze out water. Those rollers, called mangles, were notorious for accidents. Fingers, hands, even whole arms could get caught. Newspapers occasionally ran grim little notes about laundresses who lost the use of a limb through entanglement, which sounds like a sewing mishap. In reality, it meant their bones had been crushed flat by industrial-strength rollers. And even when everything went smoothly, laundry meant hours breathing in steam, standing on wet floors, with the constant risk of slipping, scalding, or collapsing from heat exhaustion. It wasn't glamorous, but Edwardian families wanted crisp linens and spotless collars, so the laundry staff kept at it, hazards and all. The kitchen itself was even worse. Imagine a coal-fired range burning from dawn to midnight, pans balanced precariously on open flames, sparks flying whenever coal was shoveled in. The kitchen was essentially an oven in summer, a smoky cave in winter, and a place where burns were almost guaranteed. Servants often carried giant pots of boiling soup across slippery flagstones. A single misstep, and suddenly someone had third-degree burns. There are records of entire kitchens being hospitalized after an accidental overturning of a cauldron. Add knives to the equation, giant, poorly sharpened cleavers hacking through meat, and the danger multiplied. Edwardian hospitals saw a steady trickle of domestic accidents that really meant the cook nearly chopped her hand off deboning a pheasant. And let's not forget food poisoning. Servants were expected to taste food before sending it upstairs, which sounds harmless until you remember the lack of refrigeration. Tasting yesterday's meat pie was practically a death lottery. If the family didn't trust the smell, they sent a servant to just check. If the servant survived, dinner was served. Congratulations, you were the canary in the coal mine. Speaking of coal dust was everywhere. Most Edwardian homes heated with coal fires. That meant coal was delivered, stored, shoveled, and constantly tended. Coal dust coated everything: the floor, the walls, the lungs. Servants tasked with carrying coal scuttles up and down stairs spent years inhaling fine black powder. Chronic coughing was so common, it had a nickname: housemaid's cough. And then there was chimney sweeping. By the Edwardian period, child chimney sweeps were less common thanks to reforms. But many houses still needed chimneys cleaned regularly, and it was filthy, suffocating work. Even if you weren't climbing the flues, shoveling out soot meant breathing carcinogenic dust. The medical term sootwort, a cancer of the scrotum first noticed in chimney sweeps, was already infamous, and yet the job persisted. Let's not forget the butler and footman. Their work looked less hazardous: carrying trays, polishing silver, opening doors. But appearances deceive. Silver polish of the era often contained cyanide compounds. Yes, cyanide. It gave a brilliant gleam and a slow buildup of poison in anyone who handled it daily. Polishing also meant hours bent over, breathing fumes from cleaning agents that stripped tarnish and damaged lungs. Some footmen developed chronic coughs that were politely blamed on weak constitutions. In reality, it was chemical inhalation. And even carrying trays was risky. Dinner for 12 wasn't light. Balancing platters up and down narrow stairs led to sprains, falls, and the occasional accidental shattering of priceless porcelain, an accident that often cost the servant their job. Housemaids had their own battlefields. Dusting, scrubbing, beating carpets all required constant exposure to cleaning products that today would come with 3 warning labels. Ammonia was common. Carbolic acid was used as a disinfectant. Bleaching powders were spread liberally. Beating carpets was its own ordeal. Carpets were hauled outside, hung on a line, and attacked with carpet beaters until dust flew everywhere. Servants inhaled the dust clouds, which carried not just dirt, but bacteria, mold spores, and whatever pests lived in the fibers. Tuberculosis spread easily this way. And don't forget the stairs. Housemaids spent half their lives running up and down them, carrying loads of laundry, coal, trays, or buckets. One slip on polished wooden steps, and the result was a broken neck. Newspapers often tucked away little notices of tragic falls in domestic service. The family mourned politely for about 5 minutes, and then advertised for a replacement. Servants also slept in some of the most hazardous corners of the house. Attics were freezing, damp, and poorly ventilated. Basements were dark, musty, and prone to gas leaks. Fire safety was non-existent. A single candle left unattended could trap servants in their narrow stairwells. Families often escaped through front doors. Servants didn't. Even the beds themselves weren't safe. Cheap iron bedsteads sometimes gave way, collapsing in the night. Mattresses were stuffed with straw that harbored bugs and mold. Add the constant exhaustion from 16-hour workdays, and servants' health deteriorated fast. And then there was the emotional hazard. Servants lived under strict hierarchies. The butler outranked the footman. The cook terrorized the scullery maid. Everyone feared the mistress of the house. Mistakes meant punishment. Dock of wages, instant dismissal, or blacklisting from future employment. Imagine working around open flames, boiling vats, and cyanide polish while knowing that one slip could not only burn you, but also end your livelihood. Families prided themselves on being benevolent employers. They weren't. Servants were disposable. Injured? Too bad. Sick? Replaced.
The turnover was constant, which meant households were always filled with inexperienced young workers, making dangerous tasks even more hazardous. Despite all this, Edwardian etiquette books painted servant life as secure and respectable. Families reassured themselves that the staff are well looked after, which translated to they were given a narrow bed, 2 meals a day, and the privilege of risking their lives for the sake of polished silver and hot soup. Some reformers tried to raise awareness. Social investigators published reports about domestic drudgery and its toll on young girls. Doctors complained about housemaid's knee, a condition from endless scrubbing on hands and knees. But change was slow. Safety equipment was rare, training was minimal, and accidents kept filling quiet hospital wards.
So, how did servants survive? Like the families they worked for, by developing coping habits. Wrapping rags around their hands to soften chemical burns, sneaking rest breaks in stairwells, looking out for each other when the mistress wasn't watching, passing down little survival tips like how to test for gas leaks by striking a match low to the ground. If it flared, the leak was above you. Dangerous advice, but sometimes it worked. And then, of course, there was sheer resilience. Servants adapted. They bore the scars, coughed through the dust, and carried on. Because for many, the alternative was unemployment, starvation, or the workhouse. A little cyanide polish was the lesser evil. So far, we've drifted through poisonous drawing rooms, toxic medicine cabinets, and the hazardous labor of Edwardian servants. Next, we'll slip into the world of Edwardian leisure, where family outings, seaside trips, and even fashionable hobbies carried their own quiet dangers. Because if the home was risky, the holiday could be worse. But for now, imagine the sound of dishes clattering, the hiss of the coal range, the scrape of knives on chopping boards. Servants moving like shadows through a dangerous ballet, keeping the house running while quietly sacrificing their health. And above them, the family dining in blissful ignorance, praising the roast and never noticing the burns on the cook's hands. The bedroom, where you were supposed to rest, but probably didn't. So, after an exhausting day of inhaling gas leaks, ingesting questionable canned meat, and narrowly escaping electrocution, you might think the Edwardian bedroom was your safe haven. It wasn't. Beds themselves could be little health hazards. Many were stuffed with horsehair, feathers, or cotton that was rarely, if ever, cleaned. Think about lying down on decades of accumulated sweat, dust mites, and if you were especially lucky, bed bugs. Bed bugs loved Edwardian homes. They thrived in wooden bed frames, feather pillows, and wallpaper seams. Waking up covered in itchy red bites was more common than waking up refreshed. But let's add some chemistry. Mattresses and bedding were often treated with mothballs, which contained naphthalene. That chemical has a charming side effect of damaging red blood cells if inhaled too much. Babies and children, tucked into cribs near piles of mothball-scented blankets, often developed anemia or worse. But hey, at least the moths stayed away. Now, wallpaper. We've already tiptoed near this, but the bedroom was ground zero for deadly wall decor. Arsenic-based green wallpaper pigments, like the infamous Shields green, were still in circulation. Every night, in the dim light of an oil lamp, your wallpaper quietly released tiny arsenic-laced particles. Inhaling them could cause headaches, nausea, or a long, wasting illness that doctors politely labeled consumption. Spoiler, it wasn't always tuberculosis. Sometimes it was just wallpaper slowly murdering you in your sleep. Carpets weren't innocent either. Heavy rugs trapped dust, coal soot, and bacteria, while dyes were often made with aniline compounds. Babies crawling on the floor inhaled all of that. Pets too. Basically, your dog and your toddler were test subjects in a chemistry lab no one asked for. Then came the lighting problem. Bedrooms often used small oil lamps or early electric bulbs. Oil lamps released smoke and carbon monoxide. Electric bulbs, as mentioned earlier, occasionally burst or set the curtains ablaze. So you could drift off to sleep knowing you might wake up with a splitting headache, a rash, or a house fire. Comforting. And finally, the furniture itself. Edwardian nurseries in particular were stocked with painted cribs and rocking chairs coated in lead-based paint. Children, being children, gnawed on crib rails like little beavers. Doctors of the time noted developmental delays in some toddlers, but no one connected it to the fact they were literally eating lead chips as a midnight snack. So yes, the place where you were meant to rest and recharge was actually a chamber of low-grade poisoning. Sleep well indeed. The kitchen, a feast of future lawsuits. If the bedroom was slow poison, the kitchen was a more direct assault. Everything here was designed to cook food, but it often cooked the occupants too. Let's start with stoves. Coal-burning ranges dominated Edwardian kitchens. They were bulky, filthy, and belched soot into the room. If your chimney didn't vent properly, carbon monoxide filled the kitchen. Entire families quietly passed out while roasting Sunday dinner. Fire brigades frequently reported houses where dinner turned fatal before dessert. If you had money, you might upgrade to a gas range, which was an improvement until the pilot light went out. Then, instead of roasted chicken, you got an invisible, odorless flood of coal gas. This again meant suffocation or explosion, depending on whether someone struck a match. It was essentially cooking Russian roulette. Food safety was another highlight. Before refrigeration became widespread, perishable food sat in ice boxes. These were wooden cabinets lined with tin with a big block of ice inside. The problem? The ice was often cut from polluted rivers full of bacteria, horse droppings, or even industrial waste. So while you thought you were preserving meat, you were actually flavoring it with cholera. Canned food, supposedly modern and safe, was another slow killer. Many cans were sealed with lead solder. Acid foods like tomatoes or fruit would leach the lead right into the food. Long-term consumers developed lead poisoning. But on the bright side, they probably didn't notice because food adulteration was rampant. Milk, for instance, was often watered down and improved with chalk or plaster dust. Bread was stretched with alum powder, which made it whiter but also caused digestive issues. And then there were meat grinders. Early versions were hand-cranked machines with exposed gears and blades. Housewives were encouraged to grind their own sausage, but if you got your sleeve caught in the crank, well, dinner was ruined. Add in kerosene lamps that tipped over, paraffin-soaked cleaning cloths that ignited, and slippery tiled floors, and the Edwardian kitchen was basically a hazard theme park. It was where you could simultaneously poison yourself, blow up the house, and burn down the neighborhood. Let's gently wander next into the Edwardian nursery, where parents unknowingly transformed child rearing into an Olympic sport of survival.